The night was thick with humidity as John Carter stepped off the Greyhound bus, his duffel bag slung over one shoulder. Elmwood, a small southern town with a history as deep as its roots, lay before him, bathed in the dim glow of flickering streetlights. The air smelled of damp earth and old wood, the remnants of an earlier rain still clinging to the cracked pavement. He took a slow breath, letting the scent settle into his senses. It had been years since he had last set foot in a town like this, where history clung to every brick, where every shadow seemed to whisper stories of the past. John was a tall, broad-shouldered black man in his late 40s, carrying the quiet authority of someone who had spent decades in law enforcement. His suit, though simple, was sharp, and his polished shoes tapped rhythmically against the pavement as he walked. He had arrived in Elmwood without ceremony, without flashing badges or announcing his presence. That was the plan. Before officially stepping into his new role as the town's first black chief of police, he wanted to experience Elmwood as an outsider. This town had a reputation. Stories of racial tension, of unwritten rules, and of justice that didn't always reach every citizen fairly. He had seen these kinds of places before, where prejudice wasn't written in law but woven into the fabric of daily life. He wasn't here to make enemies, but he also wasn't here to be a silent observer. John checked his watch. A little past midnight. The town was quiet, save for the occasional neon sign flickering in the distance. He had booked a modest room at a motel a few blocks away, choosing to walk instead of taking a cab. He wanted to see the town, feel its rhythm, listen to its silence. As he made his way past shuttered storefronts, the low rumble of an approaching vehicle broke the stillness. A black and white police cruiser rolled slowly beside him, its headlights cutting through the dimly lit street. John didn't break his stride, keeping his gaze forward. The engine idled as the car kept pace with him. A voice crackled through the speaker. "Hey, buddy, where you headed?" John stopped, turning his head slightly. Two white officers sat in the car, one in the driver's seat and the other leaning over from the passenger side. Their faces were partially obscured by the glow of the dashboard lights, but John recognized their type instantly. Young, cocky, and already convinced he didn't belong. "Just passing through," John replied evenly, his voice steady. He had encountered men like them before. He knew how this would play out. The driver, a blond man with a square jaw, narrowed his eyes. "Kinda late for a stroll, ain't it?" John gave a tight smile. "Didn't know there was a curfew." The officer in the passenger seat chuckled, nudging his partner. "Look at this one. Got himself a sharp mouth." John remained silent, keeping his hands relaxed at his sides. He had learned a long time ago that confrontations like these weren't about law, they were about power. "You got ID?" the driver asked. John hesitated for a moment before reaching into his pocket. The weight of his badge was there, tucked neatly in his wallet, a simple revelation that could end this interaction in an instant. But something stopped him, a gut feeling, a quiet voice in the back of his mind telling him to wait. He wanted to see just how far they would go. Instead of his badge, he handed over his driver's license. The officer snatched it from his hand, holding it up to the dim interior light. "John Carter," the officer read aloud. "You ain't from around here." "Nope," the officer smirked, passing the ID to his partner. "What brings you to Elmwood, John?" John held his gaze. "Just visiting." A knowing glance passed between the two officers, the kind built on unspoken rules, shared experiences. The air thickened with something unspoken. The passenger door opened, and the second officer stepped out, hand resting casually on his holster. "Step over here for a second." John exhaled slowly. He could play along, de-escalate, or he could push back. The question was, how much did he want to reveal tonight? He took a step forward. The officer grinned. "That's a good boy." Something hot coiled in John's chest, but he swallowed it down. He had faced worse, much worse, but this wasn't about pride. This was about understanding what kind of men he was about to lead. The officer patted him down, his hands rough and unnecessarily forceful. Finding nothing, he took a step back. "What's in the bag?" "Clothes," John said simply. The driver leaned an elbow against the open window. You see, John, we got a little problem. A lot of folks around here don't take kindly to strangers walking around at night. Makes people nervous. Is that so? Yeah. And you? You look like you might be up to something. John's jaw tightened. And what exactly do I look like I'm up to? The officer grinned. Don't get smart with me, boy. Before John could respond, the second officer grabbed his arm. Hands behind your back. John stiffened. I haven't done anything wrong. That's so? The officer's grip tightened. Well, I say you have. And just like that, the situation snapped. The second officer yanked John's arms behind him, metal cuffs clicking around his wrists before he could protest. They shoved him against the hood of the cruiser, his cheek pressing against the still warm metal. Welcome to Elmwood, the driver said, laughing as he snapped a picture on his phone. You're gonna love it here. John took a slow, steady breath. He knew what was coming next. He also knew something they didn't. Tomorrow, everything would change. The cold steel of the police cruiser's hood pressed against John Carter's cheek, the faint warmth from the engine contrasting with the night air. His hands were locked behind his back, the cuffs tight, cutting slightly into his wrists. He had been in far worse situations before, but the sheer audacity of it, the arrogance, the casual cruelty, was something he hadn't encountered in years. The two officers, whose names he would soon learn were Officer Daniels and Officer Reese, stood over him, laughing quietly between themselves as if this were some sort of joke. Daniels, the driver, had his phone out, snapping a few pictures, probably for some private collection or a group chat where men like him shared moments of unchecked power. Man, look at this one, Daniels chuckled. City boy thought he could just walk around Elmwood like he owned the place. Reese, the younger of the two, smirked. Yeah, must be lost or something. You sure you weren't looking for trouble, Carter? He said his last name with a mocking drawl, stretching the syllables just enough to make his disdain clear. John remained silent, breathing deeply through his nose. He had learned long ago that men like these thrived on reaction. Give them anger and they would feed off it. Give them fear and they would enjoy it even more. No, John Carter wasn't going to give them anything. Daniels grabbed his duffel bag from the ground and unzipped it. Let's see what we got here, he muttered, digging through John's belongings. Well, look at this. Nice suit, fancy shoes. You think you're better than the folks around here, Carter? John finally spoke, his voice calm. I don't think anything. I just came into town for a job. Reese raised an eyebrow. A job? What kind of job brings a man like you here at this hour? John turned his head slightly, meeting Reese's eyes. One that requires patience. Daniels scoffed. Oh, we got ourselves a real philosopher. He tossed the duffel bag onto the ground, its contents spilling onto the pavement. Ain't much in there. No drugs, no weapons. Guess he's clean. Reese clicked his tongue. Still, we got a problem, don't we? Folks don't like strangers lurking around town at night. Makes them nervous. And when people get nervous, things happen. John's jaw tightened. He had heard variations of this speech before, thinly veiled justifications for abuse of power, excuses for mistreatment. Daniels leaned in closer. Here's the thing, Carter. We could take you in, hold you for a night, maybe even charge you with loitering or obstruction. Or, he smirked, we could make this real easy. You just say, thank you, officers, and we let you go. How's that sound? John took a long pause, then spoke, his voice unwavering. I don't thank men for doing the wrong thing. The smirk on Daniel's face disappeared. The air between them shifted, growing heavier. Reese exhaled sharply. You really think you can talk to us like that? Daniels hissed. Like you got some kind of authority? At that, John finally allowed himself a small smile. You have no idea, he murmured. The sudden confidence in his voice seemed to unsettle them. Reese glanced at Daniels, uncertainty flickering across his face. Daniels, however, wasn't about to back down. His pride was on the line. Put him in the car, he ordered. Reese hesitated but followed orders, grabbing John by the arm and leading him toward the back seat. John didn't resist, didn't struggle. He simply let it happen, because he knew something they didn't. The ride to the station was silent. The only sound was the occasional crackle of the police radio and the tires rolling over the uneven road. John sat calmly in the back seat, his expression unreadable. He could feel Daniels glancing at him through the rearview mirror, as if trying to figure him out. By the time they reached the small, aging police station, John had already planned his next move. They walked him inside, leading him through the dimly lit corridors lined with bulletin boards and framed photographs of past police chiefs, all of them white. The air smelled of stale coffee and old paper. A few officers milling about the station looked up as they entered, some raising an eyebrow at the sight of John in cuffs. But no one said anything. Daniels led him into an interrogation room and shoved him into a chair. "Stay put," he snapped before stepping outside with Reese, slamming the door behind them. John sat back, exhaling slowly. He looked around the room. A simple table, 2 chairs, a camera in the corner that was probably turned off. This wasn't an official interrogation. This was intimidation. A few minutes passed. Then the door swung open again. But it wasn't Daniels or Reese. It was Captain Henry Wallace, a tall man in his 50s with graying hair and sharp blue eyes. Wallace was the kind of officer who had survived the shifting tides of law enforcement by knowing exactly when to keep his mouth shut and when to take action. He stepped into the room, his boots clicking against the floor, and stood in front of John with a look of barely contained frustration. He sighed. "Damn it." John smiled slightly. "Good evening, Captain." Wallace ran a hand over his face. "They don't know, do they?" John shook his head. "Not yet." Wallace muttered something under his breath, then reached into his pocket, pulling out a key. He walked over and unlocked the cuffs. "You couldn't have just come in like a normal person?" John rubbed his wrists. "Where's the fun in that?" Wallace exhaled sharply. "This is gonna be a mess." John leaned back, his eyes steady. "Only if you don't handle it right." The door opened again, and Daniels and Reese stepped back inside, looking confused. "Captain, we were just—" Daniels started, but Wallace raised a hand, cutting him off. "Shut up," Wallace snapped. "Do you two have any idea who this is?" Daniels and Reese exchanged glances. Wallace turned to John. "Would you like to tell them, or should I?" John stood up, adjusting his sleeves. He looked Daniels and Reese in the eyes, watching as their arrogance gave way to uncertainty. "My name," he said, his voice calm but firm, "is John Carter. As of this morning, I am the new chief of police." Silence. Daniel's mouth opened, then closed, as if his brain was struggling to process the information. Reese paled slightly. John crossed his arms. "Now, gentlemen, would you like to explain to me what exactly I was being arrested for?" Neither officer spoke. John turned to Wallace. "Captain, I believe we need to have a conversation about your department's hiring practices." Wallace sighed. "Yeah, we do." John gave Daniels and Reese one last look, then walked out of the room, leaving them standing there, stunned and silent. Tomorrow, everything would change. Silence hung in the air like a storm waiting to break. Officer Daniels and Officer Reese stood frozen, their faces pale as they stared at John Carter, the man they had humiliated just an hour earlier. Their new boss. John didn't need to say anything else. The weight of his revelation settled over them like a suffocating blanket. The smug confidence in Daniel's eyes had evaporated, replaced by something resembling panic. Reese swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. Captain Wallace let out a long sigh and turned to the stunned officers. "I'd suggest you both sit down before you embarrass yourselves any further." Neither moved at first, still processing the situation. Then, like puppets on a string, they clumsily pulled out chairs and sat, avoiding John's gaze. John remained standing, arms crossed. "Well," he said, his voice calm but laced with authority, "I think we need to talk." Reese shifted uncomfortably. "Sir, we—" John held up a hand, silencing him. "Not yet. First, I'd like to hear from Captain Wallace." He turned to the older officer, who had leaned against the table, watching everything unfold with a knowing look. "Tell me, Captain, was this a one-time incident? Or is this how your officers regularly handle strangers in Elmwood? Wallace rubbed his chin, considering his words carefully. I won't sugarcoat it. We've had issues. Some officers have gotten too comfortable with certain attitudes. His gaze flicked briefly to Daniels and Reese. And some have let power go to their heads. Daniels stiffened. Sir, with all due respect, John's sharp look stopped him cold. Don't, John said. Just don't. He stepped closer, his presence imposing. You had every opportunity to de-escalate tonight. I wasn't aggressive, I wasn't resisting. I complied. But instead of handling things professionally, you decided to have a little fun. Daniels and Reese were silent. John continued. How many others have you done this to? How many people? People without a badge, without authority. Have you humiliated like this? Neither officer answered. Reese dropped his gaze to the floor, shame creeping into his expression. Daniels clenched his jaw, but he said nothing. John nodded. That's what I thought. He turned to Wallace. I want their files. I want to know everything. Complaints, incidents, anything that was brushed under the rug. Wallace hesitated for only a second before nodding. You'll have them by morning. John exhaled. Good. He then turned back to Daniels and Reese. You both will report to my office first thing tomorrow. We're going to have a very long conversation about what it means to serve and protect. Daniels swallowed hard. And if we refuse? John smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Then you'll be turning in your badges before lunchtime. Silence. Then finally Reese nodded. Understood, sir. Daniels hesitated for a moment longer, then mumbled, Yes, sir. John nodded, satisfied. He turned to Wallace. Walk with me. As they exited the room, the weight of what had just happened settled on the officers left behind. The hallway was empty, the only sound the distant hum of a vending machine. John and Wallace walked in silence for a moment before Wallace finally spoke. I imagine you're gonna shake a lot of things up. John gave a small chuckle. You have no idea. Wallace sighed. Look, Carter, I won't pretend the department doesn't have its problems, but I need to know. Are you here to clean house, or are you here to lead? John stopped walking and turned to him. I'm here to fix what's broken. Some of your men might deserve a second chance. Others. He shook his head. They have no business wearing a badge. Wallace studied him for a long moment before nodding. Fair enough. John started walking again. Good, because tomorrow everything changes. The next morning, the Elmwood Police Department was buzzing with an undercurrent of tension. The news had spread fast. Faster than even John Carter had anticipated. Officers whispered in hushed tones, exchanging glances as he strode through the station. Some looked away, guilty and uncertain. Others met his gaze with curiosity, perhaps even a sliver of respect. And then there were the few, like Daniels, who held on to their arrogance, their jaws tight with defiance. John had been through this before. Change was never easy, especially not in a place like Elmwood. He pushed open the door to his new office, the scent of fresh coffee and old paper lingering in the air. Wallace had kept his word. A thick folder sat waiting on his desk. Officers' records, internal complaints, and reports that had mysteriously never resulted in disciplinary action. John flipped through the pages, his sharp eyes catching the patterns. Complaints dismissed, incidents not investigated. The same names popping up over and over again. A knock on the door pulled him from his thoughts. Come in. Daniels and Reese stepped inside, their postures stiff. Reese, at least, had the decency to look uncomfortable. Daniels, however, carried himself with the same cocky arrogance from the night before, though his eyes betrayed something else. Uncertainty. John gestured for them to sit. Neither did. Have a seat, he repeated, his tone making it clear it wasn't a suggestion. Reese obeyed quickly. Daniels hesitated, then finally dropped into the chair, arms crossed. John leaned back, studying them. I assume you both understand why you're here. Reese nodded. Daniels said nothing. John exhaled, setting the file down. Let's be clear about something. What happened last night wasn't just about me. It wasn't a fluke, wasn't an off night. It was a symptom of a bigger problem, one that's been ignored for too long. Reese shifted uncomfortably. Sir, John raised a hand. I'm not here to listen to excuses. I'm here to give you a choice. Daniels scoffed. Oh, we get a choice now? John fixed him with a look that made the officer shift in his seat. Yes, Daniels, you do. You can either adapt to the change that's coming, or you can walk out that door and turn in your badge. But what you won't do is continue to abuse your position and disgrace this department. Daniels clenched his jaw. Reese swallowed hard. John continued. This isn't just about respect. It's about integrity, about what this badge means. If you think that wearing this uniform gives you the right to intimidate and harass, then you don't deserve it. Silence. Then finally Reese spoke. His voice was quieter this time. I messed up. John nodded. Yes, you did. He held Reese's gaze. But if you're willing to own that, if you're willing to actually learn what it means to serve this community, then I'll give you the chance to do better. Reese looked down, shame evident on his face. Daniels, however, scoffed again. So what? We're just supposed to roll over and let you come in here and change everything? Make us feel bad for doing our damn jobs? John's eyes darkened. If you think what you did last night was doing your job, then you shouldn't be here. Daniel smirked, but it was weaker now. And if I don't want to be part of this little reform project? John leaned forward. Then turn in your badge. Right now. Daniels hesitated. He glanced at Reese, who still looked shaken. Then he let out a bitter laugh, standing up. Fine. You know what? Screw this. He pulled the badge off his chest and tossed it onto the desk. I'm not going to be part of some politically correct cleanup. John picked up the badge, turning it over in his fingers. Then he met Daniel's gaze. You were never fit to wear this in the first place. Daniel's smirk faltered. He muttered something under his breath before storming out. Reese sat frozen. John turned to him. What about you? Reese exhaled shakily. I want to do better, sir. John studied him for a moment, then nodded. Then prove it. Over the next few weeks, John made good on his promise. He cleaned house. Officers with repeated complaints and patterns of abuse were either disciplined or dismissed. Mandatory training programs were implemented. The good officers, the ones who had been afraid to speak up before, finally had someone who would listen. It wasn't easy. There was pushback, protests from within the department, resistance from members of the community who had long lost faith in the badge. But John wasn't deterred. He met with the people of Elmwood, listened to their grievances, worked to build trust. He wasn't there to be their friend. He was there to make things right. And slowly, things did start to change. The officers who remained learned that their new chief wasn't just talk, that he meant what he said, that fairness didn't mean weakness. One evening, as John was leaving the station, Wallace approached him. You think it's working? Wallace asked. John glanced at the department behind him, then at the streets of Elmwood. Not yet, he admitted. But it will. Wallace smirked. You're a stubborn man, Carter. John smiled. That's why I got the job. As he walked toward his car, the air felt different, lighter. Elmwood wasn't perfect, but for the first time in a long time, it was moving in the right direction. Justice had been served, but more importantly, it was just the beginning.